Good morning, good afternoon to everyone from across America and Europe who's joined us. I'm Tim Pilch, Issara's consultant on global supply chains. I'm based in London and have great pleasure in introducing the Issara Academy webinar entitled The Responsible Management of Workforce Reduction in Thailand in the COVID-19 Environment. So thanks so much to everyone for joining us today. We do appreciate that there have been so many COVID and supply chain related webinars in recent months. But we hope this webinar can provide some new insights and practical recommendations for easing conditions that perhaps you've not heard before. The content has been constructed by Issara's Thailand team from first-hand experiences working with suppliers and their workforces across many industry sectors. We will look to explain the current situation and challenges for migrant workers in Thailand and also provide practical stakeholder recommendations for responsible management of these workers during this very difficult times they are living through. I need to advise that this webinar will be recorded and it'll be posted to Issara's website and YouTube channel. Please do ask questions. You can use the chat box as we progress through the presentation, and we'll also endeavour to answer all questions as we go or during a Q&A at the end. It'd be great if we could have some in-person questions, comments, possibly some discussion at the end. Issara Academy webinars are definitely meant to encourage dialogue and opinion, and we greatly appreciate audience participation and you guys sharing your views. So I'm just left to introduce our presenters, who are both based in Bangkok and most definitely burning the midnight oil. John Yun is Issara's Country Director for Thailand, and Anna Maria Soto, Issara's Programme Manager in Empowering Job Seekers and Civil Society Partners. So, intro over, and time to hand you over to John to start our presentation.
Great, thank you very much, Tim. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webinar. Today, we'll be discussing the following as outlined on this slide. The underlying issues for worker reductions and the multiplier effects of COVID-19. Secondly, the situation of migrant workers in the COVID-19 environment. Thirdly, the importance of cancellation letters for MOU workers that are impacted by workforce reductions during this time. And finally, some recommendations for responsible management of workforce reduction. So next slide, please. Thank you. We would like to present on the impact of workforce reductions on foreign migrant workers in Thailand, especially MOU workers that are hired through the formal recruitment process governed by bilateral agreements between Thailand and its neighboring countries. Poor workforce projections in labor recruitment have been an underlying issue in Thailand for several years now, with overstaffing leading to cut hours and underpay on the one hand, and understaffing, which leads to overwork on the other. However, this analysis is especially pertinent in the current COVID-19 environment, where a downsizing has been exacerbated for certain sectors, such as services and tourism, apparel and footwear, and construction. Hundreds of thousands of foreign migrant workers in Thailand currently face unemployment or severe underemployment due to the struggles faced by their employers, which for some sectors is related in part to how global buyers have been reducing orders. Next slide, please. There is a clear link between irresponsible procurement and sourcing practices on the part of the global brands and retailers, and the negative effects on the workers as well as the suppliers. These practices include curtailed orders with little communication or forecasting, weak due diligence on health and safety measures during the pandemic, price structures that do not bear the costs of worker recruitment, and a lack of monitoring of rights obligations to workers. Fortunately, these harms to workers and challenges to suppliers can be mitigated significantly by global brands and retailers, fulfilling placed orders and paying for orders started or completed in full. Maintaining clear and constant communication with suppliers about orders, staying engaged in the welfare of workers during COVID-19, and adapting price structures in the current period that consider the cost of worker recruitment and retention and employer obligations for separated workers. Next slide, please. When workforce reductions cannot be avoided, urgent risks to workers can be somewhat reduced by suppliers and recruiters through more responsible handling of separations, including connecting workers to government benefits, paying severance as per the law, and allowing foreign workers the opportunity to remain in Thailand to find more stable work in less COVID-impacted industries. We will be delving into these in more detail in the recommendation section of this presentation. Now I'll hand over to Anna to present the situation of migrant workers in the COVID-19 environment.
Thank you, John. So I would like to start by sharing what Issara is doing and how we are gaining insight. So we're putting the health and safety of staff and workers first and only providing remote in-person support. Now that the situation is better in Thailand, we're restarting outreach activities, following social distancing and other measures to prevent COVID-19. However, in Myanmar, all outreach activities in person are on hold, given that the situation is getting worse. All of our workers' voice channels are fully functioning, so our helpline, call centers application, and social media channels, where we continue to support workers and job seekers in Thailand, Myanmar, Malaysia, and Cambodia to get information, ask questions, and raise grievances. During the pandemic, thousands of workers have been supported with information on government regulations, workers' rights, and practical assistance, supporting them to seek remedy from duty barriers. We are using different channels and methods to provide reliable and clear information for workers, and we are empowering and supporting them during grievances processes. In Myanmar, our civil society partners were supporting and conducting safe outreach with workers who have returned home when the outbreak started. However, in the current situation in Myanmar, they are providing information mostly by phone. Finally, with the support from Lotus Foundation, Issara has revitalized its freedom of choice and conditional cash transfer as a limited support option for Myanmar and Cambodia workers that need assistance in different aspects, such as meeting their basic needs in unemployment or underemployment, or periods while navigating a change in a job. Also, while being able to safely return home once possible, and or supporting during the period of bringing a labor case forward with their employer or local government. So this program is an empowering way to help vulnerable workers manage their critical expenses, such as food, housing, health, and transportation home when possible, and have a buffer as they plan their next step after the current economic shock that COVID has had on manufacturing in Thailand and on millions of migrant workers' families and lives. Next slide, please. So now, what's the situation for migrant workers in the current COVID environment? So for migrant workers coming to Thailand through the MOU channel, they have a recruitment contract that guarantees 2 years of work, and they have the option to extend the contract for 2 more years. However, many MOU workers are being terminated early, so that's before the 2 first years, because there aren't enough orders, so production is scaling down. In many cases, it is a forced termination and resignation, meaning that the employer forces workers to sign a document that it states that they have resigned. So in this way, the severance pay and repatriation costs are avoided by the employer. In addition, we have seen cases where there is a lack of support from the employer for workers to be able to access Social Security funds. It is important to mention here that Filing for these benefits requires the ability to complete forms in Thai language, and foreign workers are reliant on their employer to submit a form to the government confirming their need to unemployment compensation. We have also received cases from workers being furloughed, but often without pay. So for weeks or months, they haven't received any income. Now, in what concerns borders crossing, at the beginning of the pandemic, there was a mass border crossing. So there were many workers returning home. In the case of Myanmar workers, there were about 45,000 returnees between the 22nd of March to the 28th of May. And many continued to go back with the labor attaché arrangement, but the transportation fees were paid by workers, even though it is the employer responsibility to pay for repatriation costs. Now, Myanmar workers can still return home following 21 days of quarantine, but in the case of Cambodia-Thai border, there was and continued to be a lot of informal border crossing. So there is brokering going on, and of course, this comes with many risks for workers. So workers are being cheated by brokers and that promise facilitating transportation to their homes. Going back to the MOU contract, in many cases, contracts are not being renewed after 2 years. While this is legal, the problem arising is that in the COVID environment, there are twofold. So first, some employers are not taking responsibility for workers who are essentially stranded and jobless due to closed borders. So workers end up without work and without the possibility of going back home, and they are having difficulties covering their daily expenses, or they end up working illegally, facing risk of exploitation. And the second fold is that some employers are giving workers little to no advance notice regarding their intentions to continue a second contract or not, leaving workers anxious and scrambling. One positive aspect during this time is that there are good government policies and public health measures. So for instance, the Social Security Fund provides support to unemployed workers, and there are good public health measures that are now starting to get relaxed as the situation in Thailand has been improving. And the government continues to update its policies and guidance on how to manage documents for foreigners. And what concerns health and safety measures in the workplace and dormitories, based on surveys we conducted through our Workers' Voice channels, we found that they were generally safe and well prepared. But there were some challenges with transportation and restrictions in the dormitories, which in some cases caused higher expenses for workers. And it was shared by a Myanmar worker in Thailand for the Thai seafood industry. So Tim will help us read the quote.
Yeah, I'm not sure my regional English accent is entirely appropriate for quoting a Myanmar worker, but at least I'm providing a bit of contrast to Anna. I think such quotes are really important because there are other subtle exploitations of workers that are going on based more or less entirely around the situation provided by COVID. So for example, this is the quote: "There are restrictions on going out imposed by my employer to prevent the spread of COVID-19. So I have to buy food with high prices from a vendor that comes and sells within the compound."
Thank you, Tim. Can we please go to the next slide? Thank you. So as I mentioned before, some of the issues migrant workers are facing are that employers are unlawfully pressuring workers to resign. There is uncertainty regarding their contract renewal. Some workers are not receiving wages on time or at all. Workers are not receiving severance pay after being terminated. Also, some workers are not getting regular working hours or days and not being paid 75% of their wages, according to the Thai Labor Protection Act, which states that if the employer has to suspend the business in whole or in part, the company should pay no less than 75% of the wages. Moreover, workers are also facing difficulties processing and extending documents due to limited support from their employers and or restricted schedules at the one-stop service center. Another challenge that workers are facing is that their debts are increasing. They're going into new debt to cover basic needs or transportation home. At the workplace, workers have reported long working hours with insufficient breaks due to strict employers' regulations. So for instance, the lunch break time has been reduced to avoid having many workers at the canteen. But the problem is that instead of having 1 hour of break, workers get only 30 minutes, which isn't enough time to have lunch and rest. And it's also against the law, which states that workers should receive at least 1 hour of break. So the recommendation is for employers to create a schedule for break time in agreement with workers to make sure workers get enough time to rest. Another problem that workers have reported is being forced to move to a different workplace, which is a violation of the MOU contract if the proper steps are not followed and if workers do not consent to do so. So in what concerns the compensation from the Social Security Fund, some of the challenges workers are facing is that they don't get assistance from their employers to apply to the support, or the process takes too long. They don't know when they will receive this unemployment compensation. Moreover, both MOU and undocumented workers that have no job are being cheated by brokers that promise jobs in Thailand. So workers end up paying a lot of money, going into more debt, and not getting a job. Lastly, MOU workers are not being able to apply for another job due to MOU regulations and irresponsible cancellation letter inputs made by employers. So John is going to explain later how the cancellation letter impacts workers' possibility to find a new job. Next slide, please. Okay, so finally, I would like to share that what job seekers and returnees' perspective and concerns are. So in the case of returnees, some went back to Myanmar during Songkran, which is the New Year in Myanmar and Thailand for holidays, and they had valid visas. However, as they could not come back to Thailand, their visas and work permit have expired, and they don't know what to do in this situation. Now, regarding quarantine, as I mentioned before, returnees have to complete 21 days at the government quarantine centers. But some of the challenges that returnees are facing is that they have to adapt to the new reality in Myanmar, and they face social pressure from their community, as in many cases, they are seen as those bringing the virus from abroad. Now, since the recruitment has been suspended, job seekers and returnees are facing uncertainty of not knowing when they will be able to travel to Thailand to work. So returnees are having issues finding a job in Myanmar and getting an income to support their families, and job seekers that had paid for the recruitment process are in debt and without any income. As it was shared with us by a job seeker from Bago, Myanmar, that applied to a job at a factory from the seafood industry in Thailand. Tim?
Yeah, as Anna just explained, this is fairly typical of the type of call that Issara is receiving on the hotline. So I paid for a job in Thailand, 900,000 chat, about $645. But due to COVID-19, the whole recruitment process has been stopped. I had to borrow money with 10% interest rate, which means I have to pay 90,000 chat interest a month. And now I'm quite worried how to settle the interest. It is more worrisome that if the employer cancels the job and the recruitment agent do not pay back the fees and costs, my family will be in big trouble with a huge debt.
Thank you, Tim. So as we can see, returnees and job seekers are in an even more vulnerable situation than before, where they can become victims of exploitation and deception. Well, I would like to share, for the plan to restart recruitment, whenever this is possible, the Thai government said that employers should pay for quarantine and health tests. However, it is very likely that employers will not pay for that, and workers will be told to cover those costs, or they will not be taken for a job. Hence, desperate workers will offer to pay those costs. On top of that, the Myanmar government also will make it a requirement for workers to have a COVID test 72 hours prior to their departure. It costs about 200,000 jats, which is about 153 US dollar. And it is expected to be covered by workers. So some workers express high costs, but many wouldn't have other choice. I would like to highlight that at the moment, there are about 37,000 workers waiting to be able to go to Thailand to work. So as a result of the situation of not having income and not knowing when they can work, the depths of job seekers and returnees are constantly increasing. So now I would like to pass it on to John, who will provide more insights of the situation in Thailand.
Thank you, Anna. So the recruitment of foreign MOU workers is a lengthy process, with Thai employers submitting what's referred to as a demand request to the Thai government for foreign workers, which is then communicated to the governments of the countries of origin, namely Cambodia, Laos, and Myanmar. Workers are then recruited by registered recruitment agencies and sent to Thailand. Under this arrangement, as Anna has already noted, foreign workers are provided with a 2-year visa in their passport and a work permit, which is renewable for an additional 2-year period. It's important to note here that the passport and work permit is tied to the name of the employer. Also, we'd like to note that migrant workers still often take on large debt during the recruitment process and come to Thailand with the expectation that they will be able to work at least 2 to 4 years as per their contract. Though some businesses are making headway on ethical recruitment and committed to 0 recruitment fees charged to the workers, this is still quite rare in Thailand. And in large part because the laws of Thailand and the countries of origin, Myanmar, allow for some recruitment fees to be charged. And so, for example, here, the maximum allowed in terms of recruitment fees are approximately $100 on the Myanmar side and $112 on the Thai side. But in practice, many workers actually pay significantly higher fees than this for recruitment, often up to 4 to 5 times this legal maximum amount. So that means this leaves workers heavily in debt even before starting work. So they're really desperate to earn money to repay those debts and to start making a living. Given this indebtedness up front for many migrant workers, they're put in a very difficult position if they are terminated or have to resign prematurely. There are specific regulations that Thai employers must follow when a worker's job ends. Within 15 days of the worker's last day of employment, the employer is required to submit a foreign worker's job cancellation form to the Ministry of Labor, the Department of Employment, so that the government is notified. Next slide, please. So this job cancellation letter, it's so important because whether or not the foreign worker is permitted to remain in Thailand to find work with another employer is determined by what the original or former employer declares as the reason for ending the employment. Thus, a lot of responsibility and power rests in the hands of the former employer. They can either help the worker to transition very smoothly to a new job in Thailand, or essentially force the worker to leave the country and return home and start the whole process again. So the only conditions under which the foreign MOU worker can remain in Thailand to seek a new job in country without having to return home first is one, the worker has to have this cancellation letter in hand, and secondly, that letter has to have a valid reason stated in the cancellation letter and a reason that's acceptable to the government. For those whose MOU contracts were cut short, only one of 6 reasons are considered valid. Next slide, please. As you can see on your slide, this is what the cancellation letter looks like. And you can see on the form on the left, the yellow circle, that far right-hand column, the employer is required to state the reason that the employee, the worker or the employee is leaving. This is what the Department of Employment reviews and then returns the form to the employer, signed and stamped and approved by the government. And then also provides a receipt, and that's the document on the right that you can see on your slide, which confirms the government having been notified of the job cancellation letter. Next slide, please. During this COVID-19 situation, two types of migrant workers are in especially precarious situations. So as you can see, the first group is migrant workers whose contracts were ended prior to their official contract expiry due to workforce reduction and insufficient work being offered by the employer. And the second group is MOU workers whose first 2-year contracts are nearing expiry, but the employer has not yet communicated whether the second 2-year contract will be issued or not, whether that extension will be granted or not. Next slide, please. For workers whose 2-year MOU contracts are expiring, the employer can simply note in the cancellation letter that the reason for leaving is expiry of contract. And what we have found is that this is straightforward, and employers are not resistant to putting this as the reason for separation, and it is acceptable for the government, so that the worker, with this cancellation letter, the worker can find a new employer within 30 days after the last day of work. So, we should note that employers should not put in other reasons, such as the worker resigned, or the worker missed 3 days of work and was let go, or the worker changed jobs. Other kinds of reasons like this, they're not acceptable. And so the employer really needs to know what the acceptable reason is. If the worker wishes to return home, however, the worker is obligated to leave Thailand within 7 days of the last day of work, and this is according to the immigration law of Thailand. Leaving Thailand during this COVID-19 situation obviously is the far less favorable option because of the border closures, quarantine measures upon return to Myanmar, and the current ban on any migrant workers coming from Myanmar back into Thailand for work. Next slide, please. So now for the workers whose contracts are being ended prior to, those that are being ended prematurely, the cancellation letter with 1 of 6 approved reasons should be processed for the workers. This will allow the worker to find a new employer within 30 days after the last day of work. Frankly, this is where we have found that employers are often resistant to stating the appropriate reason in the cancellation letter. If the cancellation letter does not state 1 of the 6 approved reasons, which we'll get to in the next slide, the worker is obligated to leave Thailand within 7 days of the last day of work. Having to leave Thailand to return home and to seek to return back to Thailand with a new MOU contract at this point will not only be costly, but is pretty much not possible at this time because the Thai government has stopped all acceptance of new MOU workers coming in to Thailand from Myanmar, Laos, and Cambodia for the foreseeable future. Next slide, please. So for those workers whose MOU contracts have been cut short, these are the 6 reasons that will allow them to change employers in Thailand. As you can see, the first is the employer terminated the contract or died. Second, the employer abused or attacked the worker. Third, the employer failed to comply with the employment contract or the law. Fourth, that the employer went bankrupt or has reduced work capacity for the workers. Fifth is working conditions or environment that are harmful to the physical or mental health of the workers. And finally, the new employer has agreed to compensate the former employer for any costs that were incurred in the process of recruitment of that worker. Now, it's important to note that the former employers themselves complete this form, this cancellation letter, to the Royal Thai government. And so it is highly unlikely that any employers would declare either the first, second, third, or the fifth reasons, because they're all reasons that reflect very negatively on themselves. And thus it is unsurprising that the vast majority of employers simply list the reason as being that the worker resigned or some other reason that puts the responsibility for the separation on the worker. With the current COVID-19 situation and border closures, the Thai Department of Employment has noted that the following reason is also an acceptable reason, and that is that the employer stopped employment as part of a reduction of workforce due to COVID-19. And so this fits under reason number 4, basically, which is that the employer has reduced work capacity for the workers. And this is also what we are recommending former employers to note as the reason for separation, so that the workers can change new jobs, change to new employers while remaining in Thailand. Next slide, please. So here are some perspectives as to why employers may not want to provide the cancellation letter that will allow workers to change employers on the one hand, and then why migrant workers really need to be able to change employers in Thailand on the other. So if you refer to the first 2 speech bubbles at the top, we can see that employers may think that if workers resign for whatever reason, they should just note that the reason for separation is that the worker resigned. And they can argue that, oh, they don't want to write on a government form anything that's not 100% correct. But at the same time, it's really important to understand that migrant workers often resign because they're not making as much as they were promised before COVID-19. So when employers don't have enough work for their workers and work days are being cut, workers cannot afford to make so little money given the debts they've taken on to be able to come to Thailand to work. If you would refer to the next 2 speech bubbles in the middle of the slide, employers may fear that declaring to the government that they have insufficient work, which is the 4th reason that we're advocating that employers use, may tarnish their reputation or bring increased scrutiny. So they just rather say that the worker resigned or some other similar reason. Employers may think that the workers can always return home and come back to Thailand with a new MOU contract eventually. But for the workers, it's not so simple. The process of getting the MOU contract is very expensive and time-consuming, and so it seems very unfair to them to be forced to return home to find another job to re-migrate again, just because the employer's business is not doing well, and they cannot afford to pay the workers what they promised. If the workers are already in Thailand with a work visa, it just makes sense to be able to find another employer rather than have to restart the whole MOU process and fall into even more debt. And finally, if you would refer to the final 2 speech bubbles at the bottom of the slide, many employers are not providing advance notice when the worker's 2-year contract will be extended or not for a further 2 years. So the employers may themselves be feeling pressure because their buyers may cancel their orders at the last minute, and it's hard for them to forecast workforce needs and whether they will extend the worker's contract or not. However, the workers are extremely anxious and worried because they know the borders are closed. And if they're not allowed to go home, and if they don't have enough time to find a new job, they fear being stranded and jobless in Thailand. So as you can see here, there are several different perspectives on either side. Next slide, please. So here is an example of the positive impact a proper cancellation letter has on the workers. And this is a particular worker who is employed in the apparel industry in Thailand. And here again, I'll ask Tim to be the quote reader.
I am the quote reader. I felt very happy when HR told me that she will provide us, my sister and I, that is, with cancellation letters, which will allow us to register with a new employer. Although I still have a few months left on my contract, I will follow and take care of my sister, whose contract has just expired. So I feel thankful to the employer for understanding our situation in this crisis time. This factory has been good with paying wages, and that's why I've worked here for almost 5 years.
Great, thank you, Tim. Next slide, please. Okay, great. So what I have presented so far up until this slide, in terms of issuing cancellation letters that will allow workers to change employers, this is according to standard government regulations pre-COVID-19. However, what I would like to highlight here is that with COVID-19, there have been new special measures of the Thai government. And in a recent cabinet resolution on August 2020, the Thai government is actually making allowances for 4 groups of workers already in Thailand to be able to register to work until March 2022 without having to return to their home countries. So there are 4 categories of migrant workers in Thailand that are able to then extend their work registration. And so you can see those 4 categories on the slide, but what I want to highlight is in blue is the MOU workers that resigned or were terminated or couldn't find a new employer within 30 days. So as you can see, the government policy is actually making for special allowances and more flexibility for migrant workers, MOU workers, to be able to find new employers and continue to register and remain in Thailand to work. So this work permit application must be submitted by October 31st, 2020, which is coming up, and then they must undergo medical checkups and apply for visas by January 31st of 2021. And so the Thai government will continue to come up with these special measures given the fact that COVID-19 is still constraining a lot of movements of migrant workers across borders. And finally, in addition to this particular announcement, there's been a further update, which is a specific announcement from the Department of Employment dated September 29th, 2020. And here, the Provincial Department of Employment officials are instructed to be able to cancel work permits of workers whose former employers did not submit a cancellation letter on time. So thereby allowing the worker to register with a new employer without having to have a cancellation letter of the former employer. So the Department of Employment can then notify the former employer after the fact to submit the cancellation letter afterwards. And so again, another update, another special government provision, which provides more flexibility for workers to find new employers while in Thailand. Having said all that though, in conclusion, we still really are advocating for employers to really empathize with the situation of migrant workers during this time and make sure that when they're providing cancellation letters to any workers that are separating for any reason, that the appropriate reason should be stated that will allow them to change employers here in Thailand. Now I will hand over to Tim for the recommendations.
Thank you, John. So, recommendations for global brands and retailers to eliminate sourcing practices that contribute to harm to workers. So, I think initially it's worth noting that Issara are raising awareness with suppliers in Thailand, especially the implications of contract cancellation letters and the implications of how they present the reason for termination. and reminding them of obligations in ensuring redundant workers can access social security benefits accrued. These really are a couple of practical and really important initiatives that brands and retailers could take away from this webinar and communicate to supply chain. I personally think that the August 2020 Cabinet resolution, excellent initiative, but I don't think we can take it for granted that employers will always know about this situation or leave it to chance that it'll work. And I think it's really important that cancellation letters are looked into and that the suppliers understand the perspective of workers. So going through the 7 points, the 7-point recommendations. So to protect the livelihoods of workers, please cancel orders only as a last resort. I know this is an ongoing communication on so many webinars, but as a minimum, pay in full and on time for orders started or completed without renegotiation of lead times, shortening of lead times, and definitely without renegotiation on price, and try to accommodate suppliers' needs for those extensions. Encourage suppliers to avoid reducing overheads by reducing the workforce. Where retrenchment is unavoidable, please work with suppliers to ensure recommendations for ethical separation of foreign workers, that they're followed, that cancel letters are completed responsibly, as John has highlighted. Maintain clear communication with suppliers about orders and forecasts, and ensure that protections for workers are maintained. Ensure suppliers encourage workers access to grievance mechanisms so they can communicate freely and without reprisal before, during, and after retrenchment. Monitor and remain engaged with workers' welfare throughout the pandemic, understanding geographical risks and the industry sectors most affected. And ensure product costing structures consider the cost of worker recruitment and employer obligations to separated workers. And we'd also ask, please provide support to workers being retrenched but unable to get home through supporting suppliers that are housing workers, contributing to, and possibly contributing to emergency relief funds and direct cash transfers to workers. We've recommendations for Thai employers and suppliers in the ethical management of worker separation. And Issara are actively discussing these points with partnered suppliers in the region, and we'll be presenting a very similar webinar to this in Thai to the supplier community in the very near future. Recommendations are providing workers with sufficient advance notice of impending separation, whether non-renewal of MAU contracts or of termination. Inform recruitment agents, again with sufficient notice, of worker separation, and coordinate repatriation once borders reopen. When completing Department of Employment job cancellation forms, this is so important, declare the reason as stopped employment due to reduction in workforce due to COVID-19. They're to arrange safe accommodation and cover the living and accommodation costs of laid off workers stranded in Thailand, and with a note to the possibility of subtle exploitation by vendors involved in providing accommodation and food and meals, etc. And pay severance in line with employment law. We ask them to proactively connect workers with government benefits such as social security payments, and to ensure all obligations regarding employer contributions to benefit funds and the worker access are covered. To collaborate with partners, recruitment agents on both sides of the border to help entrenched workers get new and suitable employment with, we very much hope, rights respecting employers at no additional cost to workers and with their informed consent. And also finally, for workers resigning due to underemployment, reduced hours and days, please, we don't need them declaring reason for separation in the job cancellation letter as the employer resigned. far more ethical to declare the reason, as already mentioned, stopped employment due to COVID-19. And this, again, repeating ourselves, this will allow workers to find new employment within Thailand. For Thai employers operating normally, obviously continue to respect all national labour laws, international human rights standards and biocodes of conduct. Continually evaluate working conditions and the living conditions of the workers, ensuring that safety precautions put in place to protect all employees continue to be the most suitable for the regularly changing public health and legal situations, and to prepare contingency plans well in advance of any need to reduce the workforce. We want them to clearly communicate all precautions and regulations to the workforce, ensuring they are fully understood by all nationalities. Listen to and properly respond to issues raised by workers, again, of any nationality. Communications are especially important at this time because stress-induced rumours are significantly elevated. If recruiting workers from the pool of many thousands of redundant foreign workers circulating in Thailand and seeking employment, please ensure ethical processes are in place, that no additional charges are levied by the new employer, related brokers and agents, or other third parties. We've also got recommendations for origin country governments that Issara are actively promoting to relevant source and host side government agencies to fully enforce laws and regulations prohibiting illegal recruitment and those fees related being charged to workers. They need to start to ensure that these are borne by employers and recruitment agents, ideally to adopt a zero fees to job seekers and workers policy. Charge reasonable, affordable, ideally subsidised rates for transportation of migrant workers home. Charge reasonable rates for COVID-19 testing of migrating and returning workers. Employers really should be encouraged to cover such costs. They're their employees. To provide assistance to MOU workers with valid employment contracts who return to their hometown but cannot return to work due to closed borders, and to enforce the obligations of origin side recruitment agents in communicating with and supporting potentially underemployed, unemployed or stranded workers, including the facilitation of safe repatriation, again at the expense of the employer. And all this is as per the bilateral MOU. Destination country governments, we recommend to fully enforce laws and regulations prohibiting illegal recruitment related fees being charged to workers. Obviously that they're borne by employers and recruitment agents, and a zero fees to job seekers and workers policy is definitely encouraged. We'd like to encourage businesses employing foreign migrant workers and facing workforce reductions to connect workers with all available benefits and unemployment benefits. All legally employed workers who contribute to the Social Security Fund should be eligible for those benefits, but they are so reliant on employers to apply on their behalf and to, of course, made the relevant contributions throughout their employment period. Provide special provisions while borders are closed to allow recruiting employers to legally employ migrant workers already circulating in Thailand. As we all know, there are so many laid off workers unable to return home and available to work. And thank you. That is the end of our presentation.